I arrived at the hotel to prepare for my son's wedding. But the moment I stepped into the lobby, my phone buzzed. A cold message appeared. "I've canceled your room. Sleep in the lobby." I read it twice, standing there with my suitcase in hand, surrounded by strangers in designer suits laughing and chatting. I realized my own son had just erased me from his wedding, as if I were nothing more than a burden. I didn't argue. I didn't call. I simply smiled, booked the most expensive presidential suite in the hotel, and prepared a wedding gift he would never forget. Thanks for being here. Before we continue, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. Your comments mean more than you think. Also, a quick reminder, parts of this story are creatively adapted for narrative depth, and any resemblance to actual people or events is entirely coincidental. The gravel crunched under my tires like breaking bone, a sound I should have taken as a warning before I even turned off the engine. Silas Whitaker, a 68-year-old retired state bridge inspector who had spent 40 years looking for hidden fractures in steel, pulled my worn truck into the gravel lot of the Grandview Estate Hotel. I let the engine idle for a moment, the rhythmic rattle of the diesel a familiar comfort against the suffocating silence of the manicured grounds. My hands, calloused from decades of gripping suspension cables and cold iron, felt heavy on the steering wheel. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror and smoothed the collar of my best flannel shirt. I looked like what I was, a man who worked for every dime he ever saw. To my son, however, I was starting to realize I looked like a defect in his blueprint. I had driven 4 hours from the old neighborhood to attend this wedding, carrying with me a leather satchel that contained more than just a change of clothes. Inside, tucked into a secure side pocket, was a copy of the final structural assessment for the East River expansion. Davin had practically begged me to lose that report, or at least keep it from the Sterling family's due diligence team, claiming it would spook the investors. He didn't understand that a bridge doesn't care about investment cycles. It only cares about physics. And physics never lies. Have you ever looked at a bridge and known with absolute certainty exactly where the first bolt would snap? It's not a guess. It's a feeling that starts in your gut and works its way up to your throat. That was the feeling I had as I watched a pristine white Tesla Model S Plaid hum into the circular drive. I recognized the custom plates immediately. DW-GOLD. Davin Whitaker, my 34-year-old son, who now wore custom Italian suits like armor against his humble beginnings, stepped out with a look of practiced importance. He didn't look like the boy I'd taught to fish or the teenager who helped me weld the gate at 1847 Maple Drive. He looked like a man who had successfully deleted his own history. Beside him stood Alora Sterling, a 29-year-old branding consultant, whose smile was as expensive and artificial as the diamonds on her fingers. She was the daughter of the man Davin was desperate to impress, the final piece in the empire he was trying to build on a foundation of sand. I watched as the hotel manager, a man who looked like he'd been polished with the same cloth as the lobby marble, rushed out to greet them. The level of deference was staggering, the kind of bowing and scraping usually reserved for visiting royalty. They were ushered toward the private wing, Davin's hand resting possessively on Alora's waist, neither of them looking back toward the parking lot where the common guests were expected to stay. Then the phone buzzed, a digital knife to the ribs. The vibration against my calloused palm was sharp, insistent, and entirely unwelcome. I reached for the device, expecting a quick, "Glad you made it, Dad," or a room number. Instead, the screen glowed with a message that made the air leave my lungs. "Your room is canceled," it read. "Sleep in the lobby if you have to. Don't embarrass me today." I stared at the words until they began to blur into a jagged line of blue light. My own son, the boy whose college tuition I had paid for with double shifts in freezing sleet, had just thrown me away like a piece of construction debris. He wasn't just hiding me. He was actively erasing my presence from the most important weekend of his life. I looked up through the windshield, watching the heavy glass doors of the Grandview swing shut behind him. He was inside the light, and he was ordering me to stay in the dark. I felt a surge of heat in my chest. Not the panicked heat of a heart attack, but the steady, burning heat of a man who had seen enough structural failure to know when a building needed to be condemned. Davin thought he could manage me. He thought my silence was something he had already bought and paid for with the few checks he'd sent home over the years. Now, let me ask you, what would you do if your own flesh and blood treated you like a stain on a silk tie? Would you turn the key and drive back to the house he was already trying to forget? Or would you step out into the light and show them that a Whitaker is only as strong as the truth he stands on? I watched Davin reach into his pocket and pull out a small velvet box, handing it to Alora as they paused near the fountain. Even from this distance, I saw the glint of the stones. My breath hitched. I knew those diamonds. They were set in a unique filigree pattern I'd sketched myself for Sarah's 20th anniversary. Davin had told me the necklace was lost during the frantic days of the estate sale after her funeral. He'd looked me in the eye and told me the insurance company had denied the claim. But there it was, catching the orange glow of the autumn sunset, hanging around the neck of a woman who didn't even know Sarah's name. I watched the diamonds of my dead wife's necklace catch the evening light around Alora's throat, and I knew then that the bridge between me and my son wasn't just cracked, it was gone. Grief is like rust on a bridge. It starts small, invisible to the untrained eye, until one day you realize the entire structure is holding on by a prayer. I sat frozen in the cab of my truck, my eyes burning as I watched the diamonds of my dead wife's necklace catch the evening light around Alora's throat. The realization that the bridge between me and my son wasn't just cracked, but entirely gone, hit me with the force of a structural collapse. Davin had stood by Sarah's casket and told me the necklace was gone, likely stolen by one of the hospice workers, or lost in the chaos of the estate clearing. I had believed him. I had mourned that small physical piece of her, alongside her memory, never imagining that he had been keeping it in a dark corner of his new, polished life like a trophy. I reach into my pocket and pull out the silver watch Sarah gave me on our 25th anniversary. It is a heavy, solid piece of engineering, much like the life we tried to build together. As the luxury crowd moves around the hotel entrance, looking like bright, fragile birds in their silk and linen, I'm pulled back to the cold. Damp mornings I spent hanging from suspension cables over the Tappan Zee. I remember the exact smell of the river mud and the biting wind that made my joints ache, but I also remember the warmth of the lavender scent Sarah wore every time I came home. I worked those double shifts, so Davin would never have to know the weight of a rivet gun or the fear of a frayed safety line. Do you know what happens to steel when it's stressed beyond its limit for too long? It doesn't just bend, it screams. My mind raced through the last winter of Sarah's life, a time when my world was divided between the hospital and the girders. I remembered the crushing medical bills and how Davin, always so charismatic and focused on his boutique resort startup, had offered to manage the estate valuables so I could spend every moment at her bedside. "I trust you, son," I had whispered in that sterile hallway. "You're all I have left." I realized now that the necklace wasn't just a gift I'd given Sarah. It was a map. Sarah had been meticulous, much like me, and she had commissioned a hidden micro-engraving on the clasp, a specific code for a safe deposit box that held the original deeds and the true records of our family's modest holdings. Davin clearly hadn't found it yet, or he wouldn't be parading the key to our history around Alora's neck. He saw jewelry where he should have seen a legacy. He saw an asset where he should have seen a mother's love. The betrayal felt like a lid weight in my chest, a cold pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath in the cramped space of my old truck. 8 years. 2,920 days of carrying his lies like a lead vest. I looked at the reflection of the setting sun on the Grandview's glass windows, the orange glow turning the hotel into a golden fortress that Davin thought he could keep me out of. I realized that every overtime hour I'd worked, every frozen finger I'd endured on a winter inspection, was just a brick Davin had used to build the pedestal he was now using to look down on me. I looked at the text message on my phone one more time. Sleep in the lobby, and the last thread of parental hesitation finally snapped. My grief, which had been a soft, heavy shroud for nearly a decade, began to crystallize into something else. It was becoming a cold, hard resolve, a structural integrity that I hadn't felt since I hung up my inspector's belt. I wasn't going to sleep in the lobby. I wasn't going to disappear into the shadows like a ghost of the man I used to be. I looked at my worn, calloused hands, and then at the silver watch. Davin had always dismissed my job as simple blue-collar work, but he forgot that a bridge inspector is trained to see the truth that the paint job tries to hide. I was the anchor, and he was the ship. But he didn't realize that when a ship cuts its anchor, it's at the mercy of the storm. I checked the watch one more time, but I wasn't checking the hour. I felt for the small recessed button on the side of the casing. It wasn't just an heirloom. It was a high-precision recording device I had used for decades during field inspections to dictate structural flaws when my hands were too cold or too occupied to write. I had activated it the second I pulled into the Grandview lot, a habit of a man who never enters a site without a record. Every word of that text, every laugh from the valet, and every silent rejection from my son was already etched into the digital memory of the watch. I clicked the silver watch shut with a metallic snap that sounded like a hammer hitting a coffin nail. The sound echoed in the quiet cab of the truck, a final punctuation mark on the man I used to be. I didn't raise a king, Sarah, I whispered to the empty passenger seat. I raised a parasite. It was time to see if this hotel's foundation was as solid as they thought. And more importantly, it was time to show Davin that while you can cancel a room, you can't cancel the truth. I stepped out of the truck, the evening air sharp against my skin, ready to meet the son who thought I was already dead. The automatic glass doors of the Grandview estate hissed open, a sound like a snake in the grass, as I stepped onto marble floors that were never meant to feel the grit of my work boots. I didn't care about the fine layer of road dust I was trailing, or the way the lobby's scent, a cloying mixture of expensive lilies and floor wax, tried to push me back out. I was a man with a recording running on my wrist and a cold fire in my gut. I moved toward the reception desk, my eyes scanning the high vaulted ceiling and the polished brass fixtures. To most, this was a cathedral of luxury, but to me it was just a structure. And every structure has a weak point. I watched my reflection in the brass siding of the desk. My flannel shirt and worn jeans looked like a smudge on a master painting, but my posture was straight. I had inspected the spines of the greatest bridges in the Northeast. I wasn't going to bend for a hotel clerk. Jordan, the young hotel clerk, with a silver name tag, and a face that hadn't yet learned how to hide pity, stared at his computer screen as if the numbers would save him from me. He looked up, his professional smile faltering the moment he registered my appearance. I didn't wait for him to find his script. I leaned one calloused hand on the marble, the stone cool and unforgiving beneath my palm. "Check the name again?" I said, my voice low and steady. "Whitaker. Silas Whitaker." I saw his fingers dance over the keys, the frantic clicking the only sound in our small corner of the vast lobby. I knew what he was going to find, but I needed to hear him say it. I needed the watch to hear him say it. Jordan swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward a senior manager standing near the elevators before returning to me. "I'm so sorry, sir," he whispered. "The guest who booked the wedding block, Mr. Davin Whitaker, canceled this specific room personally at 6:50 p.m. He even noted that the guest associated with the room would not be attending the weekend's festivities." The words didn't sting like the text message had. They felt more like a confirmation of a death. The betrayal was no longer just a digital ghost on a screen. It was a recorded action in a ledger, a deliberate move to leave me stranded in the dark. Now let me ask you, have you ever felt the air leave a room just because you walked into it? That's the smell of money judging you. I felt the gaze of the bellhops and the lingering guests, their silence heavy with the assumption that I was a mistake that needed to be corrected. But Davin had forgotten one crucial thing about his father. I don't just find cracks. I know how to navigate them. Is that room available to the public? Or is it only subject to Mr. Davin's approval? I asked, my voice gaining a sharper edge. Jordan blinked, confused by the shift in my tone. Well, sir, the hotel is nearly full due to the merger and the wedding. But as of 5 minutes ago, the founder's suite is the only remaining vacancy. It's available, sir. But it's $4,800 a night. He said the number as if he expected me to choke on it, his eyes lingering on my worn clothes. Davin had spent the last decade assuming I was a penniless retiree, a man living on a modest state pension, and the small inheritance Sarah had left. He didn't know that for the last 8 years I had been quietly amassing a legacy fund of my own. I had taken private structural engineering consultations for bridge disasters across 3 states, the kind of messy, high-stakes work that insurance companies pay handsomely for to avoid public litigation. I had never told him. I had wanted to surprise him, to provide a safety net for his dreams, but now that net was going to become a cage. Then the card chipped. A green light. Acceptance. I slid my black premium credit card, the one issued to my private consulting firm, across the marble. I watched Jordan's eyes widen as he realized the metal card carried more weight than his entire salary. I'll take the suite for the duration of the weekend, I told him, and I expect the private wing access to be updated immediately. Jordan's professional mask didn't just slip, it shattered. He began processing the payment with a speed that bordered on desperation, but as he reached the final screen, his brow furrowed. He leaned in across the desk, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that smelled of coffee and peppermint. Wait, Mr. Whitaker. There's a flag on your name in our internal guest log. A knot formed in my stomach, tight and unforgiving. What kind of flag? Be honest with me, son. He tapped a few keys, looking genuinely distressed. It's a security note, sir. It says you are to be considered an unauthorized presence at all Sterling Ashford events. It says to alert security if you attempt to enter the ballroom or the private gardens. I was no longer a guest. I was a crack in the dam, and Davin was trying to patch me with security tape. But then Jordan hesitated, his eyes scanning the fine print of the alert. Sir, this note wasn't entered by Davin Whitaker. It was authorized by the office of Jonathan Sterling. I stood there, the dry, stale taste of hotel air suddenly bitter. Jonathan Sterling, the father of the bride, and the man whose merger depended on the very structural integrity Davin had asked me to lie about, was watching me before I even turned the key in the ignition. Jordan slid the gold keycard over the counter with a hand that shook just enough to tell me that the security note wasn't just a warning, it was a target on my back. The elevator didn't just lift me. It felt like it was pulling me away from the earth, up into a gold-leafed stratosphere where my name was a dirty word, and my existence was a liability. As the doors slid shut with a whisper that sounded more like a threat than a welcome, I looked at the gold keycard in my hand. Jordan's hands had been shaking when he handed it to me, and I knew why. That security note wasn't just a memo for the staff. It was a digital crosshair taped to my back. I stood in the center of the mirrored box, watching my own reflection. I looked entirely out of place in my faded flannel shirt and work boots, a rough-edged smudge against the polished brass and mahogany panels. The hum of the elevator motors was a deep, industrial vibration I felt in the soles of my feet, a sound that reminded me of the heavy machinery I'd spent 40 years inspecting. I caught my own eye in the mirror and allowed myself a grim, tight smile. Smile for the cameras, Silas, I whispered to myself. You're the guest they never wanted, and you're heading straight for the top. I knew that every lens in this shaft was tracking my ascent, reporting my movements back to the men who thought they could manage me like a budget overage. I watched the floor numbers climb, each chime sounding like a funeral bell for the man Davin thought I was. While the hotel staff likely saw a confused retiree who had wandered into the wrong tax bracket, I was busy looking at the seams. I discovered something as I glanced at the digital display. The founder's suite hadn't just been available. The logs showed it was pre-booked and then released by Alora Sterling personally only an hour ago. It was a baited hook. She had cleared the room, knowing I was the only one in the county with a card, black enough to pay for it, just to see if I'd have the nerve to show up. A bridge doesn't collapse because of a single storm. It falls because the rot was allowed to eat the bolts while everyone was busy looking at the view. I'd seen it 1,000 times in the field, the slow decay of integrity hidden behind a fresh coat of paint. My son and his bride-to-be were painting a masterpiece of high society bliss, but I was the man who knew where the rust was sleeping. The elevator gave a final polite ding, and the doors opened onto a hallway so silent it felt like I'd stepped into a tomb. The carpet was thick enough to swallow the sound of my boots, a plush ivory sea that led toward the massive oak doors at the end of the corridor. I pushed the doors open and entered the founder's suite. The opulence was suffocating. The air was thick with the cloying funeral parlor scent of white lilies that stood in massive crystal vases on every surface. This single room cost more per night than Sarah and I had spent on our first 3 years of mortgage payments combined. It was a temple to excess, a place where people came to forget that the rest of the world worked for a living. I felt a surge of disdain as I walked across the silk rugs, my calloused fingertips brushing against the cold, smooth fabric of a sofa. I dropped my worn leather duffel on a silk-upholstered chair, a deliberate smudge on the perfection of the room. I wonder if the silk can feel the weight of 40 years of bridge grease, I thought, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling estate below. Have you ever heard your own son's voice and realized you were listening to a stranger who happened to share your marrow? The question hit me as I turned toward the mahogany desk. There, sitting like a venomous spider in the dark, was the suite's phone. The red light on the console was blinking a sharp digital heartbeat that cut through the gloom. It was a message waiting to be heard. A piece of the abyss reached out to touch me. I sat at the desk, the air-conditioned atmosphere of the suite tasting stagnant and dry in the back of my throat. I pressed the play button, and Davin's voice filled the room. Gone was the polished, charming tone he used for his investors and his new family. This was the voice of a man who had forgotten where he came from. "I know you're there, Dad." The recording began, his voice distorted and harsh through the small speaker. "I saw the alert the second you checked in. Don't be a fool." I listened as he ordered me to stay hidden in this expensive cage, his words dripping with a mixture of fear and arrogance. He threatened to use the Ashford family's political influence to make my life difficult if I dared to step foot in the ballroom tonight. He spoke about me as if I were a defect in a construction project, a liability that needed to be contained. "Stay in that suite," he barked. "If you try to play the martyr at my wedding, I'll make sure the world thinks you've finally lost your mind." The light stopped blinking. The silence was worse. It wasn't just a request for privacy. The voicemail ended with him mentioning a conservatorship meeting scheduled for Monday morning. He wasn't just trying to hide me for a weekend. He was planning to legally seize my autonomy permanently, to strip me of my rights and my dignity, so I could never speak the truth about what he'd become. I stood in the center of that million-dollar view, Davin's threats still echoing in the rafters, and realized the red light wasn't just a message. It was a countdown to the moment he tried to erase me forever. The knock wasn't the tentative tap of a room service waiter. It was the coded strike of someone who knew exactly how to move through the shadows of a place this bright. My heart was still hammering against my ribs from the recording I'd just heard. But the sound at the door brought my training back to the surface. In 40 years of inspecting bridges, I'd learned that the most dangerous cracks are the ones you can't see until the weight is already applied. I moved toward the heavy oak door, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't ask who it was. If it was security, they'd have used a master key. If it was Davin, he would have pounded until the hinges screamed. I pulled the door open just enough to see a flash of a hotel security uniform, but the face above the silver badge was one I'd know anywhere. My nephew Arlo Caldwell, a 29-year-old security specialist with a mind for digital trails, met me in the shadows of the hotel lobby with a heavy folder tucked under his arm. He didn't wait for a greeting. He slipped inside with a frantic, calculated determination, his eyes scanning the ceiling height for the telltale glint of a lens. "Uncle Silas, don't say a word until I check the sensors," Arlo whispered, his voice tight, with an urgency that made the ozone smell of his tablet feel sharper in the air. "Davin isn't just hiding you, he's documenting you." He moved through the suite with the practiced grace of someone who spent his life looking for the back doors in a system. I watched him, my calloused hands clenched at my sides. "I'm a bridge inspector, Arlo. I know how to spot a trap." He didn't look up as he ran a handheld device near the crown molding and the light fixtures. He'd been building a dossier on Davin for months, a secret project he revealed only now as he worked. He suspected Davin was involved in his own father Timothy's financial ruin years ago, and seeing my name on the hotel's guest alert list had been the final spark he needed to move. He motioned me over to the marble coffee table, clicking his tablet shut, as the blindingly white glare of the suite's recessed lighting reflected off the polished stone. He wasn't just here to warn me. He was here to show me the structural failure of my own family. Have you ever seen a man look at his own signature and realize it was the weapon used to kill his future? Arlo opened a heavy leather folder on the table, and the sound of paper rustling against the marble felt like a tectonic shift. He laid out the blueprint of Davin's Sterling-Ashford partnership, a $12 million lie built on a foundation of stolen history. I stared at the documents, as Arlo explained that Davin had leveraged everything, even my social security number, to create a fake financial pedigree. He's selling them a version of our family that comes with a crest and a trust fund. Arlo said, his eyes hard. "We didn't have a trust fund, Arlo." I replied, the cold void spreading in my stomach. "We had overtime shifts and second-hand boots." The betrayal was layered thick as sediment in a stagnant pond. Davin had presented our modest family heritage as a dynasty of silent wealth, using my retirement records as proof of assets that simply didn't exist. It was a masterpiece of fraud, designed to lure the Sterlings into a merger that was essentially a black hole for their capital. The paper was cold. The ink was dry. The betrayal was absolute. I felt the air leave the room as Arlo pulled out the final page of the folder. It was a personal guarantee for a $280,000 bridge loan that had already gone into default. My breath hitched as my eyes found the bottom of the page. There, in the perfect flowing script I had honed over decades of filing state reports, was my signature. It was an exact imitation of the way I signed my retirement papers, right down to the slight pressure on the final stroke. "Look at the slant on the W." Uncle Arlo pointed out, his finger hovering over the forged ink. "He didn't just copy it, he traced it from your pension forms. He didn't just cancel my room, Arlo, he stole my name." I realized then that Davin hadn't just used me as a stepping stone, he had used me as the fall guy. When this partnership eventually collapsed under the weight of its own lies, the legal liability wouldn't land on Davin's tailored suit. It would land on the retired inspector whose signature guaranteed the funds. He was planning to bury me in debt and silence me with a conservatorship before I ever had a chance to tell a judge that I'd never seen this document in my life. Davin wasn't building a resort. He was building a gallows, and he'd used my life's work to weave the rope. Every hour I'd spent hanging over the river, every report I'd filed to keep people safe, had been harvested to create this noose. But as I stared at the forged guarantee, I noticed something that made the cold rage in my chest turn into a sharp, focused fire. Next to the forgery and the space reserved for the witness was a name that made the entire conspiracy lock into place. The witness signature belonged to Alora Sterling. She wasn't just the innocent bride-to-be caught in a whirlwind romance. She was the primary architect of the fraud. She had watched him trace my name, I traced the ink of my forged signature, my hand steady even as my world tilted, and then I saw it. The date of the default was the same day I had finally finished paying off Davin's college loans. The irony was a physical blow, a reminder that while I was sacrificing the last of my savings to clear his past, he was using my identity to steal my future. The ink on that page was more than just a forgery. It was a record of exactly when my son decided I was worth more to him as a victim than a father. I traced the ink of my forged name, my hand steady even as my world tilted, and then I saw it. The date of the default was the same day I had finally finished paying off Davin's college loans. Arlo didn't just bring the folder for me. He brought it for his father, and the look in his eyes told me Timothy's death wasn't the accident the police claimed it was. I looked at the loan document, the forged signature mocking me, but Arlo leaned in closer, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of his security tablet. He revealed a detail that made the air in the suite turn cold. Davin hadn't just borrowed $95,000 from Timothy back in 2019 for a failed luxury venture. He had used my state bridge inspection credentials to verify the collateral. He'd made my brother believe the investment was backed by my own professional assessment. My own flesh and blood had used my name to steal from my brother, and I had been none the wiser. Busy inspecting the steel of the Tappan Zee, while the foundation of my family was being sold for scrap. Arlo's fingers flew across the screen of his tablet, the static hum of the device filling the gaps in our conversation. He began to detail the history of Davin's desperation, a narrative of cascading debts that I never knew existed. Timothy had been losing his mind. Arlo said, his voice cracking slightly. He was trying to figure out how his own nephew could rob him, and then look him in the eye at Sunday dinner. My father was planning to go to the authorities just weeks before the accident, because Davin refused to pay him back a single cent of the $95,000. I sat back in the silk chair, the taste of cold, bitter adrenaline in my throat. Timothy always had a soft spot for Davin, I whispered. He thought he was helping him build a future, but Davin was just using him as a bridge to nowhere. Let me ask you, at what point does a son stop being your child and start being a predator? Is it the first lie, or is it the moment he decides your life's work is just a tool for his next heist? I watched the blue glare of the tablet reflect in my nephew's eyes as he traced the money trail. This current Sterling-Ashford merger isn't about expansion, Uncle Silas Arlo explained. It's about survival. The $12.5 million deal is a high-stakes shell game designed to paper over a series of defaults that started with my father's money. He's not a developer. He's a professional arsonist, and he's using your reputation as the fuel for the fire. The smell of old dust seemed to rise from the digital files on the screen, a scent of decay that no amount of hotel lilies could mask. I realized then that Davin had been running a game of financial musical chairs for years, using family names and forged guarantees to secure loans that he never intended to repay. He was building an empire on top of a swamp, and he was counting on me to be the one to sink with it when the weight became too much. The family tree wasn't just rotting. Davin had been hacking at the roots while I was busy watering the leaves, thinking I was helping him grow. Arlo pulled up a new document, a digital log from Timothy's old laptop that Davin must have thought was destroyed in the wreck. It was a draft of a letter my brother had written to Jonathan Sterling's firm, warning them about Davin's unstable financial practices and the $95,000 he'd stolen. My chest tightened, each breath shallow and ragged. This letter is dated October 12, 2020, Arlo said, his voice dropping to a whisper. My father died on the 14th. The muffled sound of wedding guests laughing in the distant ballroom drifted through the suite, a cruel juxtaposition to the dread pooling in my stomach. Are you saying, no, Arlo? I said, my voice shaking. He's reckless, he's a thief, but he's not a killer. Arlo didn't answer immediately. He just tapped a command on the screen and a grainy audio file appeared. The blue light flickered, casting long skeletal shadows against the founder's suite walls, as he prepared to play the last record of his father's life. Then the audio cut out. The scream lingered. Arlo played a short clip found in the wreckage of Timothy's phone, a recording that the police had dismissed as accidental noise. It wasn't noise. It was Davin's voice, stripped of all its polished charm, screaming that Timothy would ruin everything if he talked to the Sterlings about the $95,000 debt. The sound was raw, a jagged edge of pure malice that I didn't recognize as belonging to the boy I'd raised. The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. I looked at Arlo, my nephew, the boy who had lost a father, while I was busy trying to save a son who didn't want to be saved. I realized then that Timothy's accident wasn't the first time Davin had cleared a path for himself. He had seen an obstacle in his way, and he had removed it with the same cold efficiency a surgeon uses to excise a tumor. I stood there, the million-dollar view of the estate outside the window, looking like a graveyard, and I knew that the man downstairs wasn't my son. He was a stranger who had been wearing my son's skin, waiting for the right moment to let the bridge fall. I looked at Arlo, and for the first time I saw the true weight of the folder he carried. It wasn't just evidence of fraud, it was a map to a murder. I looked at Arlo, the silence in the suite suddenly suffocating, and I realized Timothy's accident wasn't the first time Davin had cleared a path for himself. A sliver of white paper cut through the darkness of the foyer, like a guillotine blade sliding across the marble floor until it tapped against the toe of my boot. The white corner of the envelope sat there beneath the door like a surrender flag that was actually a declaration of war. I froze as it appeared, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, uneven rhythm. I froze as it appeared, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, uneven rhythm. Arlo was already moving his heavy boots silent on the plush carpet as he reached the door and pressed his eye to the brass peephole. He held his breath, his hand hovering over the deadbolt, but he didn't turn it. I watched the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw set into a hard line that mirrored my own. After a long, agonizing minute, he stepped back and shook his head. "Did you see them, Arlo?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp. "Empty," he replied, his eyes dark with a new kind of intensity. "Whoever dropped this knows the blind spots of the hallway cameras better than I do. They didn't just walk up and knock. They moved with the precision of a ghost." I reached down and picked up the envelope, the paper feeling unnervingly cool against my calloused fingertips. There was no name, no return address, only the faint, sharp scent of hotel-grade lemon polish and something else, something medicinal and stinging like rubbing alcohol. I tore it open, and a stack of printed pages spilled out. My eyes caught a bold header at the top of the second sheet: request for involuntary psychiatric hold. The blood drained from my face so fast, I felt the room tilt. It was a draft typed and ready, showing that Davin planned to have me committed to a facility the very morning after the wedding. He wasn't just trying to hide me for a weekend to protect a business merger. He was planning to erase my legal standing entirely to prevent any post-merger interference with the stolen assets. Empty. The hallway was a gilded tomb, and inside this suite I was reading the blueprint for my own living burial. Arlo leaned over my shoulder, his breathing hitching as he saw the clinical language Davin had used to describe my supposed decline. We returned to the living area, the blinding white of the printed pages glowing under the suite's crystal chandelier. I laid the papers out on the mahogany table, my palms feeling cold and damp as I smoothed them flat. It was an email chain between Davin and Laura Sterling dating back 3 months. They weren't discussing flower arrangements or seating charts. They were coordinating a narrative. They used phrases like erratic behavior and unresolved trauma from Sarah's passing to justify my total exclusion from the family legacy. "They're not just embarrassed by me, Arlo." I whispered, the nausea rising in my throat. "They're building a case." "Look at the terminology," Uncle Arlo said, pointing to a highlighted paragraph. "Cognitive slippage, memory fragmentation. They're using clinical language to make it stick." They were treating my mind like a bridge with a rusted-out truss, ready to declare it condemned so they could tear it down and sell the scrap. Every disagreement I'd had with Davin over the last year, every time I'd mourned Sarah too loudly or questioned his spending, had been documented and twisted into a symptom of a failing brain. I turned to the last page and found a separate handwritten note tucked between the clinical reports. The alert is active. They labeled you as high risk for an episode. The handwriting was elegant, a series of sharp loops and careful crossings that looked familiar. I stared at it until the memory clicked. It matched the signature on the itinerary provided by the hotel's lead wedding planner. There was an internal rebellion brewing a crack in Davin's polished facade that he hadn't accounted for. But the weight of the warning was still crushing. I realized that every staff member I've encountered, from the valet who took my truck to Jordan at the front desk, was warned that I am a fragile old man who might snap at any moment. Davin has turned the entire hotel into a padded cell, and the bars are made of people's pity. They've already buried me, haven't they? I asked Arlo, looking at my reflection in the dark windows. While I'm still breathing. Not yet, Arlo insisted, his hand gripping my shoulder. But you have to stay calm. If you lose your temper now, if you yell or even raise your voice, you prove them right. You give them the episode they're waiting for. How do you prove you're sane when the person who knows you best is the one telling the world you're broken? The question echoed through the suite, louder than the muffled, rhythmic thumping of bass from the pre-wedding party downstairs. I felt a cold, calculated fury rising in place of my fear. Davin thought he could use my grief as a weapon, but he forgot that I've spent my life studying the way structures fail under pressure. He was trying to overload my emotional capacity, hoping I'd buckle so he could sign the papers over my head. I looked at the clinical words describing my decline and realized the trap was already shut. I wasn't a guest in the founder's suite. I was a specimen in a high-priced observation room. Davin had leveraged the Sterling's influence to turn the hotel security into his private orderlies, and I was the patient they were authorized to restrain. The alcohol scent on the paper lingered in the air, a reminder of the facility they wanted to send me to. I looked at the door, the heavy oak suddenly feeling like the gate of a prison. Now I just had to wait for the man in the uniform to come and check the lock. The knock didn't just vibrate the heavy oak door. It rattled the very foundation of the sanity I was trying so hard to project. The strike was heavy, rhythmic, and official, carrying none of Arlo's guarded tapping or the frantic energy of a man hiding a crime. I stood in the center of the suite, the printed evidence of Davin's gaslighting plot still clutched in my damp hand, and realized the trap was already shut. I looked at Arlo, who had already vanished into the bedroom wing to stay out of sight, and then I forced my breathing to level out. I stepped toward the foyer, the marble floor feeling like thin ice beneath my boots. I pulled the door open to find a tall security officer named Miller, a man with broad shoulders and a face as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. Officer Miller stood in the doorway, his thumbs tucked into his utility belt. He spoke with that same rehearsed gentleness, claiming the hotel had received a distressed family report about my state of mind. "Mr. Whitaker, do you know what day it is?" Miller asked, his eyes already wandering past me to scan the suite. "Do you know why you're here?" I tightened my grip on the doorframe, the pressure building behind my eyes. "I know exactly why I'm here, officer. The question is, do you know who paid for this room?" I watched his eyes linger on the scattered legal papers on the mahogany table. He wasn't just checking on me. He was conducting an inventory of my defiance. I noticed a small green light glowing on the center of his chest. His body camera was active. In that moment, a new layer of the blueprint revealed itself. This wasn't just a wellness check. It was a performance being live-streamed to Davin and Alora. They were watching from some darkened boardroom, waiting for me to yell, to stagger, or to show any sign of the cognitive slippage they'd documented. Let me tell you something about wellness. It's the favorite word of people who want to control you without looking like the villain. They don't want to fix you. They want to frame you in a way that makes your perspective irrelevant. Miller stepped into the foyer without being invited. his boots silent on the plush carpet. He mentioned that my son Davin had expressed deep concern about my recent episodes involving my late wife, Sarah. He spoke slowly, pausing after every sentence as if giving my aged brain time to catch up. "It's okay to be confused, Silas," he said, the scent of clinical sterile hand sanitizer wafting from him as he adjusted his belt. Losing a spouse is a heavy bridge to cross alone. I felt a surge of indignation that threatened to break my composure, which was exactly what he wanted. "Don't use my career to patronize me, son," I replied, my voice low and steady despite the fire in my gut. "I'm as steady as the steel I used to inspect." I could see him cataloging my response, translating my righteous anger into unpredictability for his report. I was a specimen under observation, and Miller was looking for the crack that would justify the diagnosis. Every logical point I made was being filtered through the lie Davin had told, a pre-written narrative that made any defense look like a symptom of the disease. He spent 10 minutes in the suite, his presence a cloying weight. He asked about my truck, my home on Maple Drive, and my plans for the wedding, all while maintaining that predatory gentleness. He eventually turned to leave, giving me a final, pitying glance that felt like a slap. "I suggest you stay in the suite for the night to decompress, Mr. Whitaker," he said, his hand resting on the brass badge on his chest. "We want to make sure tomorrow is a good day for your family." The door clicked. The cage was locked. The moment the latch engaged, the silence of the suite felt heavier than before. I was essentially under house arrest in a $5,000 a night cage, and Davin had the only key. I walked back to my duffel bag, my mind racing through the technical requirements of an escape. That was when I saw it, a tiny black plastic tab tucked into the seam of my bag's bottom. I pulled it free, feeling the cold plastic texture of a high-tech tracking device. It wasn't hotel property. It was a private tracker, the kind Davin used for his high-value construction shipments. He'd planted it before I even left home, tracking my every stop along the highway. I sat on the edge of the silk-covered bed, the muffled rhythmic thud of a distant party pulsing through the walls like a heartbeat. I grabbed my phone, my fingers moving with a speed that belied my age. I sent a high-priority coded text to Arlo, who was still hiding in the shadow of the bedroom wing. "I need the hard copy, Arlo. Now. They're trying to build a cage out of my own mind." I watched the bubbles on the screen as he typed back almost instantly. "I'm on it, Uncle. Just don't give them another reason to look at you." I looked at the tiny blinking red light of the tracker on my bag and realized Davin wasn't just worried I'd speak. He was worried I'd leave before the trap could finish me off. He wanted me here under the watchful eye of Officer Miller and his live-streaming body cam until the moment the legal papers were signed and my autonomy was gone. I looked at the dark windows of the founder's suite, seeing only my own reflection staring back, a man who was being hunted in his own family's house. I didn't hide the tracker. I put it back exactly where I found it. If they wanted to watch me, I'd give them something worth seeing. Waiting is its own kind of torture, especially when you know the person coming through the door is carrying the physical proof that your own son wants you erased. The shadows in the room felt longer as I waited for Arlo to return, every second feeling like a bolt being tightened, until the threads stripped. I paced the floor of the founder's suite, my work boots silent on the heavy silk rugs, but the quiet didn't bring me any peace. I avoided the grand floor-to-ceiling windows and the ornate gilded mirrors. I didn't want to see the reflection of the man Davin was trying to dismantle. I felt the weight of the tracker on my bag, like a physical heat emanating from the corner of the room, a tiny red eye that never blinked. I thought about the thousands of bridge bolts I've tightened in my 40-year career, the meticulous care I took to ensure every joint could hold the weight of 1,000 lives. Now I was watching my own son strip the threads of my very existence with a clinical, legal efficiency. From somewhere far below, the muffled sound of a champagne cork popping at the wedding rehearsal party drifted up, a cruel, festive soundtrack to my isolation. "How did we get here, Sarah?" I whispered to the empty air. "How did he get so hollow?" A bridge collapses when the load exceeds the structural capacity, and Davin was stacking lead weights on my soul. My pacing stopped when I heard the faint metallic scrape of a keycard. I stood frozen as the heavy oak door cracked open. Arlo slipped back into the suite, his chest heaving under his security uniform. He looked pale, his face slick with sweat under the harsh white light of the foyer chandelier, and he held a manila folder tight against his chest like a shield. He didn't speak until he had double-bolted the door and checked the bedroom wing. They almost caught me at the terminal, Silas. He rasped, the smell of toner and cheap office paper clinging to him. Davin's paying for extra eyes on the logs. He had to bypass 2 of my son's private security hires just to get into the management office's hard copy backup. He revealed that the notary who signed the official guest alert wasn't a neutral party at all. It was Jason Wheeler Davin's best friend and business fixer. The rot went deeper than I thought. It was a network of conspirators all waiting for the signal to pull the supports out from under me. Then we have to make this count, Arlo, I said, my voice sounding like gravel. Give me the file. He laid the physical guest alert form on the marble coffee table, and the stark reality of the ink on paper felt more violent than any digital text I'd read on a screen. Ink doesn't lie, but the man who held the pen was a stranger. I leaned over the table, the cold, unforgiving feel of the marble biting into my palms, as I read the words that were meant to be my epitaph. My eyes skipped over the clinical lies about my unpredictable episodes and grief-induced dementia. But it was the fine print at the bottom that stopped my heart. Davin hadn't just filed a hotel complaint. He had cited a forged medical diagnosis from a doctor I've never even seen. He didn't just sign this, Arlo. I whispered, my vision tunneling as the rage turned into an icy, focused clarity. He notarized it, with a stamp from his own development office. It was a paper trail to my coffin, a legal mechanism designed to make it impossible for me to testify against him when his merger inevitably fell apart. He was using the law as a wrecking ball, and I was the condemned building. Have you ever seen your own life story rewritten in the margins of a legal document? It makes you wonder if you ever existed at all, or if you were just a placeholder for someone else's ambition. I felt a stinging behind my eyes that I refused to let turn into tears. I looked at Arlo, the harsh white light reflecting off his glasses, and saw the same grim realization in his expression. But there was more. Tucked behind the alert was a photocopy of my own bank statement from just 3 days ago. My vision blurred as I scanned the line items. Davin had already started siphoning small amounts from my legacy fund, the money I had set aside from my private consultations, to ensure Arlo and the others had a future. He was using my own sweat and blood to pay for the extra security that was currently keeping me prisoner. Every dollar I had earned by hanging over freezing rivers was being used to buy the silence he needed to finish his heist. I was paying for my own executioner, and the realization made the cold void spreading through my chest. I gripped the edge of the marble table until my knuckles turned as white as the forged documents, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air growing thinner with each passing second, to finish what Davin had started. Arlo reached out a hand, but he stopped when my phone began to pulse against my thigh. It was a low, vibrating buzz that felt like an electric shock. I pulled the device out the screen, glowing with a series of frantic notifications from my banking app. It wasn't just small siphoning anymore. Large-scale transfers were being initiated one after another, moving the bulk of my savings into offshore accounts I didn't recognize. The red light of the tracker on my bag seemed to pulse in time with the alerts, a digital heartbeat of a predator that had finally decided to bite. I watched the numbers on the screen plummet, years of work, vanishing into the ether in a matter of seconds. I looked at the phone, then at the manila folder, and then back at my nephew. I gripped the edge of the marble table until my knuckles turned as white as the forged documents. And then my phone buzzed with the one thing I wasn't prepared for, a bank alert that signaled the beginning of my total financial collapse. The screen of my phone was a blur of red text and declining numbers, a digital hemorrhage that I couldn't stop. I stood in the foyer of the founder's suite, my thumb hovering uselessly over the glass, as the life I had built with 40 years of sweat and grit evaporated in 30-second increments. A man's home isn't just wood and nails. It's the archive of his life. And I watched mine being deleted in real time by a son who hadn't even waited for me to be gone before picking my pockets. I stood paralyzed as the phone screen pulsed with red alerts. Every notification was a hammer blow. $50,000 transferred here, $20,000 moved there, all flagged under a power of attorney I never authorized. Arlo grabbed the phone from my shaking hand, his fingers flying over the glass to trace the IP. But the damage was cascading through my accounts like a bridge in a structural fail state. Arlo, make it stop. I rasped, the taste of stale coffee and bitter regret thick in my mouth. That's Sarah's legacy fund. I'm trying, Uncle. He replied, his jaw set so tight I thought his teeth might crack. But he's using a high-frequency transfer script. He's emptying you out from the inside. It was a surgical strike. Timed to the exact moment I was locked in this gilded cage, unable to walk into a bank and scream for a freeze. My life savings were draining away like water through a rusted-out floor drain, and I didn't have a plug big enough to stop it. I felt the cold, hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach deepen with every chime of the device. Amidst the financial chaos, Arlo insisted we finalize our counteroffensive. He knew that if we didn't capture Davin's admissions now, the money would be gone forever, and I would be left with nothing but a forged signature and a psychiatric evaluation. He handed me a set of high-sensitivity digital recorders, small enough to be hidden in my cuffs, and the silver pocket watch Sarah had given me. He explained that since Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recording in-person conversations, every threat Davin makes from here on out will be a nail in his legal coffin. If they want to call you confused, Arlo said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper, let's give the court a high-definition recording of your sanity. I took the recorders, the metallic smell of the silver pocket watch familiar and grounding. I've spent 40 years listening for cracks, Arlo. I'll make sure the world hears this one. I fitted the devices with the steady hands of a man who had inspected 1,000 suspension cables, my resolve hardening into a cold, tactical shield. Have you ever realized that the four walls you called home were actually just collateral in someone else's game of pretend? The question burned in my mind as the final alert hit the screen, and this one made my knees buckle. It was a notification from the county clerk's office. A title transfer had been completed for my home at 1847 Maple Drive. Davin didn't just steal my cash. He used the forged power of attorney to sell the roof over my head for $340,000. My breath left me in a ragged whoosh. He sold the house, Arlo, I whispered, clutching the back of a silk-upholstered chair for support. He sold the garden where I buried Sarah's ashes. The betrayal was so total. It felt physical, a crushing weight on my chest that made every breath a struggle. Arlo's face went white as he looked at the buyer's info. He discovered that the anonymous holding company that bought my house is actually controlled by Alora Sterling's father, Jonathan. The bride's family was already feasting on my assets like vultures on a fallen stag. He's burning the bridges behind him, Silas, Arlo said softly. He doesn't think you have anywhere left to go. He wants you stranded, so you have no choice but to accept the facility he's picked out for you. 1847 Maple Drive. Status sold. I was a ghost in my own history. I stared at the sold notification until the blue light of the phone burned into my retinas. Realizing that Davin hadn't just taken my money, he'd stolen the only place left where I could still feel Sarah's presence. But then I saw the timestamp on the email confirmation. The sale had been finalized at 6:50 p.m., the exact same minute Davin was at the front desk downstairs, personally canceling my hotel room. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a coordinated execution. He had been signing away my home at the very moment he was trying to erase my presence from the hotel. A single, involuntary tear traced a path through the deep lines of my face tasting of salt and the absolute end of my mercy. I looked at the silver watch in my hand, the recording light, a tiny invisible beacon of the truth. Davin thought he had left me with nothing, but he had forgotten the one thing I still possessed, 40 years of experience, finding the one rusted bolt that brings the whole structure down. I looked at Arlo and saw my own righteous fury reflected in his eyes. The financial ruin was only the first wave. The real storm was waiting for me in the files Sarah had left behind. I stared at the notification one last time before clicking the screen black. Davin had sold my house, but I was about to show him that some foundations can't be bought. There are some lines a man should never cross, even if he's starving for success. And Davin hadn't just crossed them. He danced over the grave of the woman who would have given him her last breath for free. I stared at the sold notification until the blue light of the phone burned into my retinas, realizing that Davin hadn't just taken my money. He'd stolen the only place left where I could still feel Sarah's presence. The financial ruin was only the first wave. The real storm was waiting for me in the files Sarah had left behind. I sat at the small mahogany desk in the suite, the glow of the laptop reflecting off my inspection glasses as the clock on the wall mocked me with its steady, heartless ticking. It was 2 a.m, the hour when the world is quiet enough for the ghosts to speak. Arlo had bypassed the encryption on Davin's primary Capital Group folder, revealing a subdirectory labeled SW Final Expenses. My hand shook as I moved the cursor. I expected to see hospital bills, hospice receipts, perhaps a ledger of the funeral costs I thought I had shared with my son. Instead, I found a high-resolution scan of Sarah's life insurance policy from North Atlantic Mutual. It was a policy we took out 40 years ago, back when the ink on our marriage license was barely dry, to ensure I wouldn't be a burden when she was gone. He's been tracking this since before she even went into hospice. Silas Arlo whispered, the smell of his stale energy drink clashing with the expensive lilies in the room. I paid those premiums with every weekend shift I ever took. I replied, my voice sounding like grinding gravel. That was meant to be our peace of mind. How much is a mother's life worth in the current market? To Davin, it looked like exactly $500,000 and a luxury suite. I opened a file dated 3 weeks before Sarah passed, a time when she was drifting in and out of lucidity, her world reduced to the 4 walls of our bedroom and the sound of my voice. It was a change of beneficiary form. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath hitching. The signature at the bottom bore a haunting resemblance to Sarah's elegant script, the same looped S, the same trailing H, but the ink was too smooth. The pressure too consistent for a woman who could barely hold a spoon at the time. My son hadn't just waited for the inheritance. He had actively diverted the $500,000 death benefit from me to his own shell company, Whitaker Heritage Developments. While his mother was still fighting for her life, she wouldn't have signed this. Arlo, I said, the soul-crushing betrayal feeling like a physical blow to my solar plexus. She wanted me taken care of. Arlo pointed a steady finger at the metadata on the screen. Look at the IP address on the digital submission, uncle. It came from Davin's office at 3 a.m. He didn't even have the decency to do it while the sun was up. The signature was a masterpiece of murder. As Arlo dug deeper, the entry twist of the knife went even deeper into my gut. He revealed that the notary who had verified the forged insurance signature wasn't some faceless bureaucrat in a city office. It was the same Officer Miller who had just performed the wellness check on me an hour ago. The realization hit me like a freight train derailing. Hotel security wasn't just working for the Grandview. Miller was on Davin's personal payroll, a fixer wearing a badge to give the fraud a veneer of legality. Davin had built a cage of men like Miller to keep the truth from ever leaving this hotel. Arlo sat back, the dry electronic heat emanating from the laptop, making the air feel stagnant. If you're not sane, Silas, you can't testify in probate court that she was too sick to sign. This $500,000 was the seed capital he used to convince Jonathan Sterling. He came from a family of significant wealth. He stole her legacy to buy his way into a family that doesn't even want me in the room. The insurance theft wasn't just greed. It was the cornerstone of the entire $12 million merger lie, and I was the only witness left who could pull the pin. Davin wasn't just building a company. He was harvesting our family's bones to make the foundation. I felt a cold, calculated fury replacing the grief, a clarity that only comes when you see the true shape of the rot. Arlo clicked into a final subfolder, and a series of photos filled the screen. My heart stopped. There were photos of Davin and Alora Sterling, tanned and smiling, lounging on a white sand beach in the Maldives. I looked at the date stamp in the corner. They were vacationing on the very day of Sarah's funeral. The initial insurance payout had funded their getaway, while I was standing in the rain, watching the only woman I ever loved be lowered into the earth. I stared at the timestamp on the Maldivian beach photo. It was the exact hour I had been standing alone at the cemetery, clutching a handful of dirt and wondering how I'd ever survive without her. The sound of the laptop fan whirred like a distant siren in the silence of the suite, a mechanical dirge for the family I thought I knew. The morning light that filtered through the suite windows was cold and gray, matching the temperature of the blood in my veins as I pulled on my jacket. The sun was rising on Saturday morning, and the time for lurking in the shadows was over. I looked at Arlo, my eyes gritty from lack of sleep, but sharper than they had been in years. "I'm going to find him," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm going to make sure he sees me before the end." The morning light in the Grandview estate didn't feel like a new beginning. It felt like a spotlight on a crime scene that everyone was pretending was a celebration. I stared at the timestamp on the Maldivian beach photo. It was the exact hour I had been standing alone at the cemetery, clutching a handful of dirt, and wondering how I'd ever survive without her. The cold, gray morning light filtered through the suite windows, matching the temperature of the blood in my veins as I pulled on my jacket. I stepped out of the founder's suite, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me with the finality of a prison latch. The hotel corridor was silent, the air thick with the smell of floor wax and the ghosts of my own memories. I walked toward the elevator bank, my hands buried deep in my jacket pockets, fingering the small, cold casing of the digital recorder Arlo had given me. I had positioned myself near a specific alcove where the lighting was dim, and the security cameras, according to Arlo's earlier sweep, faced a distinct blind spot. I needed Davin to feel safe enough to be cruel, and I knew exactly which buttons to press to make the structure of his ego buckle. The elevator doors chimed and Davin stepped out. He looked like a prince in a tailored charcoal suit, his face radiating the kind of confidence only a man who has successfully buried his conscience can wear. He froze for a split second when he saw me, his eyes darting to the empty hallway, before his mask of pity slid on faster than a bolt into a sleeve. "I saw the bank alerts, Davin," I said, my voice as steady as a suspension cable. "I saw the title transfer for Maple Drive." I watched his expression shift, a flicker of annoyance crossing his polished features before he sighed a sound full of rehearsed disappointment. "Dad, you're doing it again," he said, stepping closer until I could smell the sharp, citrusy scent of his expensive cologne. "You're confusing your dreams with reality. We talked about the house sale months ago. You signed the papers because you wanted to simplify your life after Mom passed. Don't you remember?" He spoke slowly, the way a person might talk to a startled animal, but I saw the predatory glint in his eyes. He was a polished skyscraper built on a swamp of lies, and he actually believed the glass would hold when the ground started to shift. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I stayed exactly where Arlo told me the audio would be clearest. "You think I'm confused about my own home?" I asked. "The garden where I buried Sarah's ashes." He stepped even closer, his silk tie rustling against his crisp shirt, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper that didn't match the pleasant, concerned expression he kept for the benefit of the cameras down the hall. "Listen to me, Silas," he hissed. "The security team is on high alert for any episodes you might have. If you even look in Jonathan Sterling's direction today, I'll have you escorted out in handcuffs for your own safety." I'm doing this for you. I'm protecting your dignity. I felt the bitter taste of rising bile in my throat, but I kept my hands still. You think a few security guards can stop a man who knows where the cracks are? I whispered back. Davin laughed, a hollow, dry sound that had no joy in it. Handcuffs aren't a good look for a man of your age, Silas. Don't force me to protect you from yourself. He was counting on the world to believe the son over the father, the suit over the flannel. Have you ever felt the urge to dismantle something you spent 30 years building, just to prove it was never as strong as it looked? As I watched my son, the boy I'd once carried on my shoulders so he could see the fireworks over the river, I realized he had become a foreign object in my own life. He reached out and patted my shoulder. A gesture meant to look like affection to any passing staff, but it felt like a snake's tongue on my skin. He was branding me as the invalid, the embarrassing old man who needed to be managed. "Order the steak, Dad," he said, his voice returning to its loud public volume as a bridesmaid rounded the corner. "It's the last meal you'll have on my dime. Go back to your room and get some rest. You're clearly exhausted." He turned away from me, his movements fluid and confident, heading toward the grand staircase where the rest of his bright, fake world was waiting. He didn't even look back. He was so certain he had won, so sure that he had stripped me of everything, my money, my home, my sanity, that he didn't realize he'd just given me exactly what I needed. Every threat, every gaslighting lie was now etched into the digital memory of the device in my pocket. He patted my shoulder. It felt like a snake's tongue. I stood in the corridor, the hard, unforgiving texture of the hallway carpet under my boots, feeling like the only real thing left in this building. I watched him descend the stairs, his head held high. But then a flash of light caught my eye as his sleeve shifted. My breath hitched. On his wrists, catching the cold morning light, were the vintage gold cufflinks Sarah had given me the day I retired from the State Bridge Commission. They were engraved with my initials and a tiny representation of the Tappan Zee. He hadn't just stolen the house and the money. He was looting my very body, wearing my pride as if he'd earned it. I watched the gold of my own retirement cufflinks disappear around the corner on my son's sleeves, and I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting for the right to exist in the same world as the monster I had created. I let the silence of the hallway settle over me, my resolve hardening into something colder and more dangerous than Davin could ever imagine. I wasn't an embarrassing old man. I was an inspector, and I had just found the fracture that would bring his entire world down. The courtyard was a masterpiece of manicured hedges and white stone, a beautiful place for a cold-blooded execution that required no blade, only a few signatures on a legal brief. The crisp morning air bit at my skin as I stepped onto the pristine gravel. I needed air that didn't smell like Davin's sharp, citrusy cologne or the cloying lilies of the lobby. I needed air that didn't smell like Davin's sharp, citrusy cologne or the cloying lilies of the lobby. I stepped into the crisp morning light, my work boots feeling heavy on the pristine white gravel. The sound of the central fountain splashing like a rhythmic heartbeat was the only thing filling the silence of the garden, a steady pulse that mocked the frantic pace of my own blood. I rounded a tall, perfectly squared hedge and found Alora Sterling waiting for me. She wasn't wearing her wedding dress yet. She was in a sharp, ivory power suit that made her look more like a prosecutor than a bride. She stood by the stone basin of the fountain, her eyes tracking my approach, with a look of profound, elitist disappointment. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she adjusted her watch and sighed. "You were given instructions to stay upstairs, Silas," she said, her voice a cool, practiced melody. "You're making this very difficult for Davin." I stopped 10 feet from her, the blinding white of the courtyard stone under the intensifying sun making me squint. "Davin is the one who made things difficult when he sold my home." "Alora," I replied, my voice as steady as the girders I used to measure. "I'm just here to see the foundation crumble." She didn't flinch. In fact, she smiled, and it was a revelation of sharp, calculated intent. I realized then that she wasn't just Davin's accomplice. She was the architect. She leaned back against the fountain, the sharp, cloying scent of her Chanel No. 5 drifting toward me on the breeze. She admitted with a terrifying lack of shame that she was the one who suggested the specific holding company that bought my house. She had been targeting my assets even before Davin had officially proposed, seeing my history as a resource to be harvested for her family's merger. Have you ever looked at a beautiful woman and seen the exact geometry of a shark's jaw? That was Alora in the morning sun. She saw me as a line item to be balanced, a structural defect that needed to be paved over to ensure the Ashford deal went through without a hitch. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a single sheet of cream-colored paper, offering it to me with a grace that felt like a threat. She called it a severance agreement, with a strict non-disclosure clause. If I remained silent through the ceremony and signed away any claims to the Sterling-Ashford merger, Davin would consider returning a portion of the proceeds from 1847 Maple Drive within 12 months. The language was deliberately vague, full of legal loopholes. It was a transparent lie, a hollow promise designed to buy my cooperation until the $12.5 million deal was legally irrevocable. Think of it as a temporary loan for your son's future, she urged, her voice low and reasonable. You'll get your home back when the dust settles. I looked at the paper and then at her. I've spent my life measuring the strength of steel, Alora. I know when a beam is hollow, even if it's painted gold. I'm not signing away my sanity for a promise made by people who steal from the dead. My rejection was the hammer strike that finally cracked her mask of civility. The melodic tone vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory focus that made the air in the courtyard feel thin and frigid. The conservatorship wasn't a safety net. It was a concrete casing they were planning to pour over my life, until I was just another pillar supporting their empire. Alora stepped closer, her heels clicking on the stone like the firing pin of a rifle. She leaned in her face inches from mine, and her perfume was suddenly suffocating. She told me they had already prepared the emergency conservatorship filing based on the guest alert and the forged medical records Miller had notarized. Refuse, and you won't just lose your house, Silas, she hissed, her eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying certainty. You'll lose the right to choose your own doctor, your own food, your own life. We will have you declared legally incompetent before the cake is cut. You'll be a ward of the state, and Davin will be your guardian. You'll never speak to my father, and you'll never see the inside of a courtroom. I felt the taste of bitter ash in the back of my throat, a primal terror that almost made me buckle. But beneath the fear, I felt the steel in my spine harden. You're threatening to bury me alive? I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. But you forgot one thing, I'm the one who knows where the bodies are buried. She smiled. It was the sound of a closing trap. She looked at me as if I were a piece of equipment that had finally outlived its usefulness, then turned on her heel to walk back toward the hotel. She moved with a cold triumph, her victory already decided in her mind. I stood there, the sound of the fountain splashing against the stone basin sounding like a countdown. As she reached the door to the west wing, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, personalized, embossed napkin to dab at a stray drop of water on her sleeve. She let it fall as she stepped inside a discarded scrap of her perfect day. I waited until the door hissed shut before I moved. I walked over and picked up the crumpled napkin she'd accidentally dropped. My fingers traced the rough texture of the paper as I unfolded it. There, in her sharp, elegant handwriting, was a note: 12 p.m. boardroom. Final sign-off. The ink looked like dried blood against the ivory paper. I looked at the hotel clock tower. I didn't have a weekend to save myself. I didn't even have a day. I had exactly 3 hours before the signatures were dry, and I became a ghost in my own life. I picked up the crumpled napkin she'd accidentally dropped, my fingers tracing the 12 p.m. scribbled in ink that looked like dried blood. And I realized I didn't have a weekend to save myself. I had exactly 3 hours. Time wasn't just ticking away in that gilded hotel room. It was eroding each second, a grain of sand falling from a foundation I had spent 40 years trying to keep level. I sat on the edge of the silk-covered bed, the crumpled napkin Alora had dropped clutched in my palm. The noon deadline was no longer a vague threat. It was a physical weight pressing against my chest. I stared at the door of the founder's suite, my mind racing through the legal maze they were building around me. A conservatorship meant more than just losing my bank accounts. It meant losing my voice, my autonomy, and the right to stand up for the truth of my own life. I felt strategically desperate, a bridge inspector who had found a catastrophic crack in the main support beam, but had no tools to patch it. The silence of the room was stifling, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning that tasted like stagnant iron. I knew I needed a miracle, or at least a single piece of evidence that Davin couldn't explain away as the ramblings of a confused old man. A light, hesitant knock sounded at the door, pulling me out of the dark spiral of my thoughts. I stood up, my joints stiff, and moved toward the foyer. When I opened the door, I found Lily Miller, a 23-year-old server, whose oversized uniform seemed to swallow her small frame, standing by a silver breakfast tray. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were darting toward the hallway cameras with a visible terror that made my own fear feel secondary. She wheeled the tray inside with hands that trembled so violently the china rattled against the silver. Once I closed the door, she let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "I'm not supposed to be here, Mr. Whitaker," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the suite. "They're watching the staff logs. They told us to stay away from this floor." I watched her carefully, noting the haunted loyalty in her expression. "I know a structural failure when I see one, Lily," I said, my voice softening with unexpected empathy. "Why are you risking your job for me? Let me ask you, have you ever been handed the exact weapon that could destroy your own child and felt a sick sense of gratitude?" Lily didn't answer my question directly. Instead, she reached for the linen napkin on the tray and lifted it to reveal a small, nondescript USB drive hidden beside a bowl of lukewarm, steel-cut oats and honey. "I found this in the green room," she whispered, her eyes still fixed on the door. "Davin and Alora were in there this morning preparing their vows, or rather their contracts." She looked at me then, and I saw a flash of shared history in her gaze. "My father was Elias Miller. He worked the Tappan Zee under you for 15 years. You were the one who fought the board to make sure my mother got his full pension after the accident at the pier. He always said you were the only man on the job who didn't look through people." She pushed the tray toward me, the sound of a silver spoon clicking against porcelain echoing in the room. "Take this. It's the audio from their final prep meeting. They left the digital recorder running while they went to check the floral arrangements. They were laughing, Silas, laughing about how easy it was to rebrand an old man's legacy into their own startup capital. "You're a brave girl, Lily," I said, taking the drive. The plastic was cold against my palm, but the weight of it felt like a mountain. "I won't let this be for nothing." The drive was cold. The information was incandescent. She nodded once, a sharp, quick movement, and then she was gone, slipping back into the hallway before the security log could flag her presence. I was left alone in the blue glow of the suite, the smell of honey and oats cloying in the air. Lily mentioned that the recorder was left running accidentally. They'd forgotten to turn it off when they stepped out. This wasn't stolen. It was abandoned property that hotel staff had every right to secure. I moved to the desk and plugged the drive into my laptop. My breath hitched as the waveforms appeared on the screen, jagged lines of green light that represented the end of my son's masquerade. I pressed play, and the room was filled with the digital ghost of Davin's voice, stripped of the charm he used for the cameras. I sat there, a man who had spent his life listening for the sound of metal fatiguing and heard the sound of a soul snapping instead. "Once the ring is on and the papers are signed," Alora's voice came through the speakers, crisp and clinical. "Silas is just a line item we can write off. The conservatorship papers are already in the folder for the noon meeting. It'll be over before he even knows he's lost. I heard Davin chuckle a sound that made the sharp, metallic tang of fear rise in my throat. He's always been soft, Alora, he said. He'll believe the confused story because it's easier than admitting his own son hates him. By Monday morning, his objections will be legally invisible. Listening to that recording was like watching a controlled demolition of my own heart, one floor at a time. I watched the waveform of my son's laughter spike on the screen as he joked about my fading mind, and I realized that the bridge I was about to burn wasn't his. It was the one I had used to keep him safe for 34 years. He wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my identity to build a throne for a woman who viewed me as a nuisance. But as the recording continued, Alora mentioned one more thing that changed the geometry of the entire morning. Make sure the staff has the boardroom on the 4th floor ready by 11:30, she said. The signing happens before the public ceremony. I stared at the screen, my resolve hardening into something lethal. The note from the courtyard had said noon, but the audio told me the real execution was happening in the executive boardroom on the 4th floor. I had 90 minutes to get there. The 4th floor of the Grandview estate was silent, a heavy, expensive silence that usually precedes a major structural failure. I moved through the narrow service corridors, the scent of industrial cleaner and stale laundry, a sharp contrast to the lilies and perfume drifting through the vents from the floors above. I had the blueprints Arlo memorized etched into the back of my eyelids. I knew exactly where the blind spots in the security sweeps were navigating the labyrinth of utility pipes and gray metal doors like a shadow. My work boots, usually so loud on gravel, felt unnervingly quiet on the thin industrial carpet of the staff halls. I reached the frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom, just as the clock in the distance began its slow, heavy toll for noon. I stood there for a heartbeat, my hand hovering near the brass handle, listening to the muffled resonance of Davin's voice. He was performing his tone smooth and practiced as he presented the Whitaker legacy to the Ashford Global Partners. He spoke of our family history as if it were a solid block of granite, a foundation of generational wealth and stability. Instead of the hollow house of cards, he had spent the last 8 years building on a swamp of stolen insurance money and forged signatures. "I'm coming for your foundation, Davin." I whispered to the empty air, the high-pitched ringing of adrenaline starting to swell in my ears. I watched the silhouette of my son through the glass, his hands moving in wide, confident gestures that I knew were meant to distract from the lack of substance in his projections. Davin was a cantilever bridge with no counterweight, reaching out over an abyss and wondering why the shore was getting further away. He believed the height of his ambition would protect him from the gravity of his lies. I felt for the small switch on the side of my pocket watch, ensuring the live stream Arlo was monitoring remained active. Every word spoken in this room was being etched onto the hotel's secure server, in real time, a digital record that Davin's fixers couldn't delete with a keystroke. I waited, my breath shallow, for the exact moment he mentioned family stability. It was the cue I needed, the stress point, where the load would become too much for the structure to bear. I pushed the heavy doors open. The room was a temple of dark wood and leather, the smell of expensive tobacco and old money hitting me like a physical weight. The men in tailored suits turned as one, looking at me like I was a glitch in a high-definition broadcast, a rough-edged ghost in flannel and denim interrupting their curated reality. Davin's face went from triumphant to ashen in a fraction of a second, his rehearsed smile twitching as he realized I'd escaped his wellness lockdown. "Dad, what are you doing?" Davin asked, his voice cracking just enough for the partners to notice. "You're supposed to be resting. The doctor said the episodes would be worse today." I walked past the mahogany sideboard, ignoring his attempt to steer me toward the door. "I've had enough rest, Davin," I said, my voice steady and low. "I'm here as the legal owner of the assets you used as collateral. This deal was built on my stolen identity, and I have the right to stop it." I felt the cold, smooth surface of the mahogany table under my fingertips as I approached the head of the long board where Jonathan Sterling sat. Sterling watched me with a gaze that was unreadable, his eyes tracking the manila folder I held against my chest. Have you ever walked into a room where everyone is richer than you and realized you're the only one who actually owns the truth? It is a lonely, powerful feeling. I saw the sweat breaking through Davin's expensive foundation, the beads forming at his hairline, as he realized I wasn't there to make a scene, I was there to conduct a demolition. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about this merger, are you still with me? Choose blood. If you think family ties should outweigh the crime, or justice, if you believe the truth must be served regardless of the cost, and add a 5-word reason. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the core message of justice is what matters most. If you prefer strictly factual retellings, you are free to stop the story here. I ignored my son's frantic pleading and turned my attention fully to Jonathan Sterling. Mr. Sterling, you're a man who values character. I said, the weight of the forged signatures feeling like a gavel in my hand. I suggest you look at the character Davin used to sign my name. I pulled the physical folder from my jacket and dropped it onto the mahogany table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was sharp, like a structural beam snapping under a sudden load. I slid the evidence of the $280,000 default and the unauthorized sale of my home across the table until it rested in front of the man about to invest $12 million into a vacuum. Silas, you're confused. Davin stammered, his face a pale mask of desperation. The medication is making you paranoid. This is exactly what the doctors warned us about. He reached for the folder, but Jonathan Sterling's hand moved faster, pinning the documents to the table with a firm, silent authority. The room went silent. The mahogany table was cold. My resolve was fire. I watched as Sterling flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing, as he compared the signatures on the debt default to the ones on the merger agreement. The silence stretched, becoming a vacuum that Davin tried to fill with more lies. But the weight of the ink on the page was undeniable. Jonathan Sterling didn't look at Davin. He looked at the forged signature on the house sale, then back at me with an expression that told me the wedding wasn't the only thing about to die in this room. He looked at me, then back at the papers, and I realized he wasn't just surprised. Sterling revealed a detail I hadn't expected. He already had a private investigator looking into Davin's shell companies, and my documents were the final piece of the puzzle he had been waiting for. The hands that grabbed my shoulders were heavy, but they couldn't pull me back until Jonathan Sterling spoke, his voice cutting through the room like a cold front hitting a heat wave. I looked back to see Sterling holding the forged house deed up to the light, his eyes narrow and clinical, ignoring Davin's frantic, high-pitched excuses. Officer Miller and another guard dragged me toward the boardroom doors, their grips tight enough to bruise my arms through my jacket. Davin is practically screaming now, a frantic animal caught in a snare, shouting about security breaches and elderly episodes and how I need to be medicated immediately. But the other investors aren't looking at Davin anymore. They are already whispering among themselves, closing their laptops with final, decisive snaps. The air in the room has turned toxic for his deal, the smell of expensive leather and old money now sour with the scent of a failing fraud. While Miller was dragging me toward the exit, I managed to slip a small secondary recording device into Jonathan Sterling's jacket pocket, a desperate, sleight-of-hand gamble to ensure I would hear the private aftermath of this explosion. I've seen enough for now, Davin Sterling says, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. Escort him back to his suite. Gently, Miller shoves me into the elevator, the heavy brass doors closing on the chaos of the 4th floor. The silence inside the mirrored box is absolute, save for the rhythmic hum of the lift and the heavy breathing of the guards. Miller stands in front of me, his shadow stretching across the polished floor. He threatens to have me arrested if I leave the founder's suite again before the wedding ceremony is over, his hand resting on his service belt in a way that is meant to intimidate. I stand straight, smoothing my jacket, and meeting his gaze in the mirrored walls. letting him see that the confused old man he was hired to bully is gone. I've spent my life inspecting bridges that were better built than your son's lies, Miller. I say, my voice steady as stone. One more stunt, and you're spending the night in a cell. Silas, he snaps back. But I can see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knows the foundation is shifting. Have you ever felt the weight of 40 years of work being used as a weapon against you? It makes the steel in your spine feel very, very cold. The doors hiss shut. The silence was an indictment of everything Davin had tried to build. Arlo is waiting in the suite, his fingers flying across his keyboard with a frantic energy that matches the smell of his burnt coffee lingering in the air. He doesn't ask how it went. He can see the bruises on my arms. We spend the next hour organizing every piece of evidence into a physical master folder. The bank alerts, the forged POA, the insurance theft, and the butt dial recording Arlo just finished cleaning up. We label each lie, numbering them like structural defects on a condemned bridge. This is the kill folder, the final assessment of a structure that cannot be saved. The sharp, paper-cut sting of the manila folders is a reminder of the work that still needs to be done. We are preparing for the one public forum Davin can't escape, the altar. The seed of doubt is planted, Silas Arlo says, the blue light of his screen reflecting off his glasses. Now we just have to make it bloom in front of 500 witnesses. Every lie Davin ever told me is in this folder, I reply, feeling the cold, heavy weight of it in my lap. It's time he sees the bill. What happened next would shock everyone. Arlo stops typing, his shoulders going rigid as a notification chirps on his secondary monitor. Someone is pinging the hotel server, Silas. Someone from an outside IP is trying to access your medical records, and it's not Davin or Alora. My heart skips a beat. Who else would be looking for proof of my decline? Arlo's eyes move rapidly across the code. I don't know, but they're efficient. It's like they're looking for a specific entry. The muffled sound of the wedding string quartet beginning to tune their instruments downstairs drifts through the vents, a haunting, dissonant sound that signals the beginning of the end. This folder wasn't just paper anymore. It was a demolition charge, and the ceremony was the detonator. I realize that the bridge I am about to cross is the most dangerous one yet, but for the first time in 8 years, I am the one with the blueprint. I watch Arlo work the rhythmic tapping of his keys, the only sound in the room, as the afternoon sun begins to dip lower, casting long, skeletal shadows across the silk rugs of the founder's suite. I snapped the folder shut, the sound echoing through the suite like a gunshot, and realized that for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't the one carrying the burden, I was the one about to drop it. Arlo didn't look up from his screen when the notification chirped again, but the way his shoulders went rigid told me we weren't the only ones hunting for the truth. He discovered a digital link to a mystery police report, a file that hints Jonathan Sterling might already be working against Davin from the inside. The weight of the folder in my lap feels like a gavel ready to fall. I looked at the door, knowing that the next time I walked through it, there would be no more hiding, no more wellness checks, and no more lies. I checked my pocket watch, the time for the ceremony approaching like a rising tide. The structure of my family was about to undergo a final catastrophic stress test, and I was the only one who knew which bolt to pull. I stood up the old suit I had packed, feeling like armor ready to walk into the ballroom and watch the house of cards finally collapse into the river. Arlo didn't look up from his screen when the notification chirped, but the way his shoulders went rigid told me we weren't the only ones hunting for the truth in this house of mirrors. I had just snapped the folder shut, the heavy thud of paper on marble echoing like a final judgment, when that small digital chime changed the geometry of our entire offensive. I watched my nephew's reflection in the dark window of the founder's suite. His eyes were moving at a speed that suggested he was reading lines of code I couldn't even see. "Uncle Silas," he whispered, his voice tight with a mixture of awe and terror. Someone else just pulled the trigger. He turned the laptop toward me, showing a flickering screen that detailed a preliminary fraud report filed with the Connecticut State Police. It had been submitted from a guest terminal in the hotel lobby exactly 3 hours ago. The report was encrypted, but Arlo had managed to snag the metadata. It contained specific financial data regarding the Whitaker debt and the forged power of attorney that only Dave and Alora, or a very high-level investor, could possibly know. I felt a cold prickle of realization. Jonathan Sterling didn't just walk away from that boardroom earlier. He had triggered a legal failsafe before I even presented him with the kill folder. There was a formal case number already attached to my son's name. Sterling isn't just a billionaire, I muttered, looking at the blinking cursor. He's a shark who protects his waters, and Davin just dumped blood in the pool. Arlo's fingers resumed their frantic dance across the keyboard as he dug deeper into the hotel's internal security logs. He discovered something that made my breath hitch in my throat. Jonathan Sterling had secretly authorized the hotel security to let me out of the suite for the ceremony, explicitly overriding the lockdown orders Davin had filed this morning. I wasn't being kept here by Sterling's whim. I was being staged. He wanted me at that ceremony as much as I wanted to be there. Have you ever noticed that the loudest sound a building makes is the one right before the first support beam snaps? It's a groan of overstressed metal that signals the end of the structure's life. I felt that groan in my own bones now. My phone, sitting on the marble tabletop like a live grenade, suddenly screamed. Davin's name flashed in bright, aggressive red. I answered it, and the voice on the other end was no longer the polished, confident CEO I'd seen in the corridor. It was a cornered animal, panting and frantic. "What did you tell him?" Silas Davin shrieked, the sound distorted by the phone's speaker. "You've just burned $12 million and your own son's future. Jonathan has frozen the joint escrow accounts. If you don't fix this in the next hour, I'll ensure you never see the outside of a psychiatric ward." My hand was steady as I held the device. "I didn't burn it, Davin," I said, my voice like grinding gravel. "You built it out of dry straw and expected me to provide the shade. He wasn't my son anymore. He was a debt collector for a life he never earned." As he continued to screech threats about conservatorship and legal ruin, I realized his panic wasn't just about the merger failing. Arlo flagged a secondary document on the screen. Davin had already used Alora's family credit to take out a secondary high-interest loan to cover his earlier defaults. If the Sterling merger didn't close by 3 o'clock, he wasn't just losing a business deal. He was facing total, immediate bankruptcy and a very real possibility of a prison cell for predatory fraud. He had doubled down on a losing hand, and he was trying to use my silence as his final chip. I hung up on him mid-sentence, feeling a strange, hollow peace settle over me. I walked over to my duffel bag and pulled out my old inspection suit, the one I wore to every bridge opening for 40 years. It still smelled of mothballs and cedar, the scent of a long, honest career. I pulled on the jacket, the fabric heavy and grounding, and reached for the small piece of silver I had kept in the inner pocket. It was my state inspector's service pin. I pinned it to my lapel, the sharp, metallic click echoing in the quiet room. It represented a life where the truth was the only thing that kept the traffic moving. Arlo watched me, and for the first time today, the fear in his eyes was replaced by a grim, familial pride. "You look like the man who taught me how to read a blueprint, Silas," he said softly. "I wasn't just putting on a suit. I was putting on my armor for the last bridge I'd ever have to condemn." I looked at myself in the gilded mirror, the silver pin catching the afternoon sun cutting through the suite windows. I didn't see an embarrassing old man or a confused retiree. I saw an inspector who had finally found the bodies under the bridge. "The bridge is condemned, Arlo," I told him, checking the kill folder one last time. "I'm just here to clear the traffic before the collapse." I could feel the cold, dry texture of the manila folder under my arm, the weight of it feeling like a gavel. Every lie Davin ever told, every forged signature, and every stolen dollar was inside that folder, organized with the same meticulous care I had once used to document rusted trusses and failing rivets. I checked my pocket watch. It was 2:30. The processional would be starting soon in the Crystal Terrace Hall. I looked at Arlo, who was finishing the upload of the boardroom audio to a secure cloud drive. "If we're going to do this, we do it in front of everyone," I said. He nodded, his face setting into a mask of resolution that mirrored my own. I checked the kill folder one last time, the silver pin on my lapel catching the afternoon sun like a sniper's glint, and I knew that when I walked into that hall, I wouldn't just be an uninvited guest, I'd be the witness for the prosecution. The file was only 40 seconds long, but it contained enough poison to kill the Whitaker name forever, and hearing it again made the silver pin on my lapel feel like a lead weight against my heart. I stood in the center of the founder's suite, the heavy silence of the room amplifying the static hiss of the digital recording. Arlo stood by the desk, his hands hovering over his laptop, his face a mask of grim anticipation. I pressed play on the digital recording from June 2025, a voicemail that had been born from the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won. It was a butt dial Davin had made while intoxicated at a celebratory dinner, his voice thick with expensive bourbon and the casual cruelty that had become his second skin. I listened as he bragged to Jason Wheeler about how he had eased Sarah's transition to ensure the $500,000 insurance policy cleared before the hospital bills could eat the estate. The recording wasn't an accident. I realized now that Timothy had installed a remote trigger recording app on Davin's phone months before his own death, suspecting Davin was up to no good and hoping to catch a confession. "She was going anyway," Jay Davin's voice slurred through the speaker, the sound of a clinking glass audible in the background. I just gave the clock a little push, adjusted the dosage. $500,000 is a lot of breathing room. The casual way he described adjusting her morphine dosage turned my grief into a cold, murderous clarity. He didn't just steal her money. Arlo. I whispered, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. He stole her time. The recording hissed. The truth burned. I closed the laptop, the snap of the lid sounding like a gunshot in the plush suite. Every minute Sarah had left was a gift I would have traded 40 years of work for, and Davin had treated those minutes like a budgetary inconvenience. I checked the silver watch on my wrist, the recording device inside it, still humming, catching every breath of my resolve. I picked up the manila kill folder, the weight of the paper feeling like a weapon I was finally ready to discharge. I walked toward the door, my work boots striking the marble foyer with a rhythmic finality. I was done with shadows and whispers. I was going to the altar to show the world the exact geometry of my son's collapse. I exited the suite and found Davin waiting by the elevators. He was dressed in a pristine tuxedo, the silk lapels catching the corridor light, but his eyes were bloodshot and wild, darting toward the hallway cameras. He blocked my path, his shadow stretching across the gold-patterned carpet like a dark stain I could no longer ignore. He looked at my suit, at the silver inspector's pin on my lapel, and his expression shifted from panic to a frantic, desperate pity. "You're not going down there." Silas Davin hissed, his voice dropping to a low vibrate that rattled in his chest. "I won't let you ruin this. You're confused. You're sick. If you step on that elevator, I'll have security restrain you before the doors open." I stood my ground, my posture as straight as a steel truss. "You ruined this years ago, Davin." I replied, my voice devoid of the warmth I had spent 30 years cultivating for him. "I'm just here to show everyone the rubble." He realized then that I wasn't wearing the patient persona he had tried to build for me. I was the man who used to decide which bridges were safe to cross, and I had just condemned him. How do you put a price on the last sunset your wife never got to see? I watched him struggle for air, his confidence evaporating like mist under a heat lamp. He was a cantilever bridge with no counterweight reaching out over an abyss, and wondering why the shore was getting further away. Davin reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a heavy cream envelope. He held it out to me, his hands trembling so violently that the paper rattled. "It's $50,000, Dad," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Cash. Right now." Just walk to the parking lot. There's a black car waiting near the fountain. It'll take you wherever you want to go. I'll have Alora's father set you up in a luxury facility in Florida. You'll have everything you need." He tried to shove the envelope into my hands, the green ink of his desperation practically visible through the thick paper. He was offering me a lifeboat made of the same salt that was currently drowning him. I looked at the money, then at the son I raised, and I realized the cash was just more scrap metal from the life he had dismantled. I didn't reach for it. I didn't even blink. I let him see the bottomless disgust in my eyes. $50,000, Dad," he whispered, leaning in until I could smell the fierce sweat cutting through his expensive cologne. "Please. Just for today. I'll see you at the altar, Davin," I said, stepping around him. "Make sure your vows are worth the price." He patted my shoulder. It felt like a snake's tongue. As I walked away from the bribe, leaving him standing by the mirrored elevator doors, I realized I wasn't alone in the corridor. Jason Wheeler, Davin's fixer, and the man who had notarized the forged documents, was watching from the shadows of a recessed doorway. Jason didn't look like a conspirator anymore. He looked terrified. He wasn't afraid of me. He was staring at Davin with an expression that suggested he realized the bridge they were standing on was about to undergo a catastrophic failure, and he didn't have a harness. I didn't stop to talk. I headed toward the grand staircase, the first notes of the pipe organ processional beginning to reverberate through the hotel's floorboards like a distant thunderstorm. I let the envelope of cash hit the floor with a dull thud, the paper bursting slightly to reveal the stacks of $100 bills, and I walked toward the ballroom doors as the heavy, carved mahogany barrier loomed ahead. I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was the witness for the prosecution, and the trial was about to begin in front of 500 people. The ballroom doors were 10 feet of carved mahogany, a final barrier between a multi-million-dollar lie and the light of day, and I didn't knock. I dismantled the silence with the weight of the truth. I let the envelope of cash hit the floor with a dull thud, the paper bursting slightly to reveal the green ink of my son's desperation. And I walked toward those doors as the first notes of the processional began to play. The music was heavy with simulated grandeur, a regal organ melody that filled the hallway and made the very floorboards vibrate beneath my boots. I pushed. The doors gave way with a groan of heavy hinges swinging open to reveal the Crystal Terrace Hall in all its sickening gilded glory. 500 guests in silk and wool turned as one, a sea of startled faces that blurred into a single collective gasp. I walked down the center aisle, my work boots striking the silk runner with a rhythmic thud that drowns out the string quartet. I didn't look at the crystal chandeliers or the thousands of dollars in white lilies. I looked straight at the altar. At the front of the room, Davin looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face went beyond ashen. It turned a translucent, sickly gray. His hand trembled so violently, he almost dropped the ring he was trying to slide onto Alora's finger. Alora stood frozen, her veil catching the light like a spiderweb, her expensive smile finally shattered. I reached the front row and stopped directly in front of Jonathan Sterling. "Stop the ceremony," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the authority of a man who had spent 40 years condemning structures that weren't fit to stand. "Dad, please, get him out of here." "Security!" Davin shouted, but his voice lacked its usual polish. It was the high-pitched squeal of a failing rivet. Have you ever stood in a room of 500 people and realized you're the only one who isn't wearing a costume? I felt the weight of every eye in the room, but I felt no shame. I only felt the cold, hard clarity of a job that needed to be finished. The officiant reached the moment of objection, the silence in the hall becoming a physical pressure. I didn't just speak. I reached into my jacket and handed the kill folder directly to Jonathan Sterling. I announced to the entire room that the man at the altar is a fraud who sold my home, stole his mother's insurance, and forged my name on a $250,000 debt, I declared. Davin tried to physically lung at me, his tuxedo jacket bunching at the shoulders as he bared his teeth, but Arlo appeared from the side entrance with the hotel security team. They weren't moving toward me. They were moving toward the altar, acting now on the explicit authority Sterling had granted. "He told you I was confused, Jonathan," I said, looking the billionaire in the eye. "Take a look at the signatures in that folder and tell me who the confused one is." The music died. The truth screamed. Sterling didn't hesitate. He flipped the folder open, his eyes scanning the forged power of attorney with a grim, surgical focus. Then the sound system hummed. Arlo had reached the booth. The butt dial recording began to blast through the ballroom's high-end speaker system, the audio so clear it felt like Davin was standing in the center of the room, drunk and bragging. His voice, thick with bourbon and casual cruelty, echoed off the crystal chandeliers as he talked about giving the clock a push on Sarah's life to cash the policy. The collective gasp from 500 people sounded like a dam breaking a visceral wave of horror that made the air in the room turn cold. I watched Alora Sterling step away from Davin as if he were made of plague. She didn't look like a bride anymore. She looked like a survivor. She reached into her bouquet and pulled out a folded document, a prenuptial exit clause she had prepared in secret. She handed it to Davin right there at the altar, a total disavowal of his debts and his name, before a single word of the vows could be exchanged. The audio wasn't just sound. It was a wrecking ball hitting the center support of Davin's life. "You killed her. You actually killed her." "For the money," she whispered, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "It's a fake. It's an AI deep fake. Jonathan, don't listen." Davin screamed, his eyes darting toward the exits, but there was nowhere left for him to run. Two detectives from the Connecticut State Police, who had been waiting in the wings per Arlo's tip, stepped onto the altar. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. "Davin Whitaker, you're under arrest for felony fraud and suspicious death investigation," the lead detective said, his voice a flat, professional monotone. Jonathan Sterling stood up, his presence towering over the ruins of the ceremony. He turned to the Ashford Global Partners and publicly declared the merger dead. Then he looked at me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice heavy with a new kind of respect. "I was sold a lie, but I'm looking at the truth now. Look at him. The golden boy tarnished by the very heir he thought he owned." I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like an inspector who had finally found the bodies under the bridge. As the detectives shoved Davin through the carved mahogany doors, he turned back. He didn't look at me. He looked at Alora, and a jagged, terrifying smile split his face. "You think you're clean?" he hissed, his voice echoing one last time. She was the one who suggested the morphine idea. Silas asked her whose idea it was to give the clock a push. The accusation hung in the air like a poisonous mist. Alora's face didn't change, but her eyes went dark, a shutter closing over a secret. The taste of salt and copper filled my mouth as I realized the rot didn't stop with my son. I stood there as the wedding guests remained in stunned silence, the lilies smelling like a funeral, and the lights of the chandeliers feeling too bright to bear. As the detectives shoved Davin through the doors, he turned back and looked at Alora with a smile that made my blood run colder than the winter river, because he wasn't going down alone. I looked at the folder in Sterling's hand and knew the reconstruction was only just beginning. The silence that followed the collapse of the wedding was louder than the music had ever been, a hollow ringing in my ears that told me the structural failure of my family was finally total. I sat with Arlo in the quiet, dim riverside cafe of the hotel, my hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had gone stone cold. Outside the tall glass windows, the evening sun was dipping behind the jagged line of the hills, casting long, bruised shadows across the water. I felt aged not just by years, but by the sheer weight of the debris I was now forced to sort through. My son was in a cell, the Sterlings were gone, and I was left standing in the ruins of a life I thought I knew. The hushed, echoing acoustics of the nearly empty cafe made every clink of a spoon sound like a gavel. We were waiting for someone, a ghost from the hospice ward, who had reached out to Arlo the moment the news of the arrest broke. Rebecca Morrison, a 52-year-old hospice nurse with deep circles under her eyes and a voice that sounded like it had spent too many years whispering in the dark, sat down across from us with a heavy signed statement. She didn't offer a smile. She offered a confession. "I saw him, Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice trembling. "He didn't think I was looking when he turned the dial on your wife's morphine drip. I tried to report it, but the medical group heavily funded by Davin's early investors threatened my license into silence." Rebecca's words were like a slow-motion collapse of a suspension bridge. I could see every cable snapping, but I was powerless to stop the fall. I closed my eyes, the smell of stale coffee and the cloying scent of lilies from the lobby making my stomach turn. "Why didn't you come to me, Rebecca?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp. "I would have protected you." She looked down at her calloused hands. "I was afraid, Silas. He told me you were already slipping, that no one would believe an old man over a successful developer. But the real reason he did it wasn't just the insurance. Sarah had found the records. She discovered the $95,000 debt Davin owed Timothy. She was going to tell you the truth that morning. That was the entry twist that broke me. He didn't just kill her for the money. He killed her to keep his secret from reaching my ears. My grief, which had been a heavy, dull ache, sharpened into a jagged blade of righteous fury. Arlo reached across the table, his grip on my forearm the only thing keeping me moored to the chair. "We're going to Riverside Springs, Silas. We need to talk to Trevor." Driven by a new, darker suspicion, Arlo and I left the hotel and drove through the night. The trip to Riverside Springs was a journey through the graveyard of my memories. The drive was silent. The low hum of my truck's engine a stark contrast to the chaotic ballroom we had left behind. We reached Blackwood Auto Repair just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. Sir Trevor Blackwood, a 48-year-old mechanic with grease permanently etched into the cracks of his knuckles, wiped his hands on a rag and led us into the back office of his repair shop. "Have you ever realized that the very tools you used to build a life were used to dismantle the people you loved?" The question haunted me as Trevor pulled up the high-resolution forensic photos of Timothy's car on a cold digital monitor. The glare of the screen was harsh, stripping away the comfort of the shadows. Trevor didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pointed to a specific section of the undercarriage, his oily rag dancing over the image. "Look at the edges, Silas. This wasn't a failure. This was a demolition. The brake line hadn't frayed from wear or road debris. It was a clean surgical snip. The photo didn't lie. The metal had been bitten clean through." I leaned in, my breath hitching as Trevor zoomed in on the microscopic pattern of the cut. Every tool leaves a fingerprint, a fracture signature unique to the man who used it. He reminded me of a weekend in 2015, just days before the accident, when Davin had borrowed my heavy-duty mechanical wire cutters to fix a fence at the old house. I stared at the jagged edge in the photo, and my blood ran colder than the winter river. The notch in the steel matched the nick in my own blade, the one I'd used for 20 years to trim suspension cables. "Those were my tools, Trevor." I whispered, the taste of cold metallic air in the shop filling my lungs. My own hands built the weapon. The overwhelming guilt was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the room spin. I had provided the means for my son to murder my brother, all while I was busy looking for cracks in the world's bridges and ignoring the rot in my own home. Trevor reached into a small steel locker behind his desk and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. He revealed he actually kept the severed brake line in a secure locker for years, waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. He had known it was murder from the start, but without a suspect or a motive, the police had walked away. Now, seeing the connection to Davin and the $95,000 Whitaker debt, the physical proof was an indictment. I held the bag, the cold plastic and the heavy steel within it, feeling like the final bolt in a death warrant. I stared at the jagged edge of the brake line in the photo, the specific notch from my worn wire cutters staring back at me like a familiar, accusing face. I looked at Arlo, whose face was a mask of grim determination. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. The bridge was gone. There was nothing left to save, only the final accounting to be settled. I straightened my suit jacket, the silver inspector's pin glinting in the harsh fluorescent light, and I knew where we had to go next. The truth had finally surfaced from the river, and it was time to make sure Davin saw every single piece of it before the door to his cell clicked shut. The fluorescent lights of the forensics lab hummed with a clinical indifference, a sharp contrast to the jagged emotional wreckage I was carrying in my pocket. I had spent my life studying how things break, but standing in that sterile room, surrounded by the steady, low-frequency hum of server racks and the smell of ozone, I realized that some fractures can never be patched. I was there to witness the final authentication of the digital evidence, the last few bolts being driven into the case against my son. Sarah Winters, a 34-year-old forensics tech with a surgical focus and eyes that had seen too many waveforms of human cruelty, adjusted her headset with a practiced, weary grace. She motioned me over to a high-definition monitor where the butt dial voicemail was laid out like a topographic map of a disaster. She showed me the visual representation of Davin's voice, pointing out the unique compression artifacts and frequency spikes that proved the file hadn't been edited or generated by artificial intelligence. The metadata confirms the transmission originated from Davin's phone at the exact coordinates of the restaurant where he was celebrating, Sarah explained, her voice as flat and precise as the lines on her screen. Voices are like fingerprints, Mr. Whitaker. Your son's cadence and pitch variance are a 97.3% match. The waveform on the screen was a heartbeat made of data, proving that even a dead woman can speak from the grave if you know how to listen to the silence. It's not just a match, Sarah, I replied, my voice sounding like gravel under a heavy load. It's a confession I wish I never heard. I watched the green line spike as Davin's recorded voice laughed about giving the clock a push. Sarah tapped a key and a sub-analysis appeared. She revealed a background sound we hadn't noticed before, a specific distorted stream of a song called Midnight Train. The unique compression signature of that stream matched the hotel's public Wi-Fi logs from that night, completely debunking Davin's earlier alibi that he had been in a dead zone on a coastal road. Every bit of data was a brick in a wall he couldn't climb over. I stood there watching the blurry, blue-hued glow of the waveforms, feeling a grim validation that tasted like ash. The technical finality of it all was a relief, but it was the kind of relief that only comes after the structure has already collapsed. Have you ever watched a man realize that his entire future has just been reduced to a single 30-second audio file? I moved from the lab to the observation room of the precinct, where the glass was cold and unyielding against my forehead. I watched through the two-way mirror as Davin met with his high-priced defense attorney. The room was small, lit by the same harsh, unforgiving white light, stripping away any last bit of the luxury Davin had tried to hide behind. The arrogance he had maintained since the wedding, the indignant protests, and the claims of a frame-up finally began to leak out of him. His attorney listened to the forensic report and reviewed the photos Trevor had provided of the cut brake lines, and I saw the moment the foundation finally gave way. Davin turned gray, a shaking terror taking hold of his hands, as his lawyer whispered that reasonable doubt had left the building. He looked toward the mirror, his eyes wild and pleading, though he couldn't see me. "He's my father," I heard him whisper through the speaker system. "He wouldn't actually send me to prison." I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just watched the son I had raised realize that the truth doesn't care about bloodlines. The pen scratched against the paper. The sound of a life ending. The district attorney's representative entered the room with a stack of legal parchment that looked like a death warrant. The offer was final 15 years for second-degree murder. In Sarah's case, the deliberate morphine adjustment constituted intentional killing for financial gain, plus multiple counts of felony fraud and identity theft, with the investigation into Timothy's death remaining open and likely to add vehicular homicide charges. I watched Davin pick up the ballpoint pen, the same hand that had forged my name on a $250,000 debt, and prepare to sign away his freedom. I felt a hollow grief, a satisfaction that was tempered by the memory of the boy who used to help me weld in the garage. "Sign it, Davin," I whispered to the glass. "It's the first honest thing you've done in a decade." He hesitated, his knuckles white, before scrawling his name across the bottom of the plea deal. "I did it for us," he muttered to the empty room, still trying to build a bridge out of lies. "I did it to make the Whitaker name mean something." He didn't understand that a name only means something if it's anchored in the truth. As Davin finished signing, he slumped back in the metal chair, his spirit seemingly leaving his body. But then he leaned forward, his voice a low hiss that the microphone barely caught. He mentioned that Alora was the one who had encouraged him to use the wire cutters from my mechanical kit, suggesting she was the true mastermind behind what happened to Timothy. It was the exit twist I had been expecting, the final betrayal in a life built on them. The detectives had already interviewed Jason Wheeler, Davin's notary and fixer. Faced with forensic evidence of his forged stamps and the threat of a 20-year sentence for conspiracy, Jason had flipped within hours. His testimony detailed every fraudulent document he'd notarized, every fake medical alert he'd signed. The State Bar Association had already begun proceedings to revoke his license permanently. I turned away from the glass as the detectives led my son out the back door, the scratchy sound of the pen still echoing in my mind. For the first time in 8 years, the air in my lungs didn't taste like ash. The weight on my chest hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, becoming something I could finally carry. I walked out of the precinct into the cool Monday afternoon air, the sun hanging low over the horizon. The case was closed, the signatures were dry, and the Whitaker legacy was in ruins. But I still had one more bridge to cross before I could find the shore. I needed to go back to the river one last time. I felt for the notebook in my pocket, ready for the final entry. The river in January is a sheet of slate gray, moving with a silent, heavy purpose that reminds me how much weight a single life can carry before it finally reaches the sea. The months that followed the trial were a blur of legal recovery and quiet mornings, a slow reconstruction of a life that had been stripped to the girders. I turned away from the glass as the detectives led my son out the back door of the precinct, and for the first time in 8 years, the air in my lungs didn't taste like ash. Now the cold bite of a Connecticut winter feels clean. I sit on the small balcony of my new apartment, a modest space that smells of fresh pine and the steam from my morning coffee. The legal battle to reclaim my name and some of the siphoned funds was a long, grinding process, but it is mostly over. I walked away with enough to live simply and with my head held high. One of the first things I did was establish a scholarship fund for the children of bridge workers. I donated the majority of the recovered legacy fund to it, ensuring Davin can never touch a penny of that money, even if he finds a way to talk himself out of a cell early. It felt right to turn Sarah's peace of mind into a foundation for someone else's future. I watched the water move under the ice. Forgiveness isn't about fixing the broken bridge. It's about deciding you've spent enough time standing in the ruins. Arlo visits every Sunday, bringing donuts and a stack of newspapers he knows I won't read, but the company is what matters. Our relationship is the only bridge that survived the collapse entirely intact, and perhaps it is stronger for the stress test it endured. He sat with me this morning, looking out at the frozen river with a quiet sort of pride. "You've got the inspection report on your own life back to satisfactory, Silas," he said, his voice light but sincere. I took a sip of the bitter hot coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. "It's more than that, Arlo. The rot is gone. That's all that matters now. We don't talk about Davin much anymore, but the weight of his absence is a structural reality I've learned to navigate. I've realized that you can't force a man to be honest if he's determined to be a ghost." I receive a final letter from Davin, postmarked from the State Correctional Facility later that afternoon. I sit in my living room, the winter sun casting long, pale shadows across the floorboards. I read the words, once my eyes scanning the familiar, desperate slope of his handwriting. He doesn't ask for forgiveness. He asks for money to fund an appeal. He's still trying to leverage our blood for a lifestyle he no longer owns, still trying to find a crack in the foundation of my resolve. I'm still your son, Silas, he wrote. You owe me a chance to fix this. I set the paper down on the coffee table and looked at the empty space where Sarah's portrait used to hang. No, Davin, I whispered to the quiet room. I owe the truth the space to breathe. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt small, remember the smallest bolt is often the only thing keeping the whole world from falling into the river. I didn't feel the burning rage I expected. I only felt a profound, quiet pity for the man who never learned how to build something real. On the last day of the month, I walked down to the local bridge, the one I spent my first year as an apprentice inspecting. The smell of crisp winter air and river silt is familiar, a comfort that anchors me to the present. I run my hand over the cold, gritty texture of the bridge railing, feeling the deep vibration of the cars passing above. It's a rhythmic, healthy sound. I open my old inspection notebook, the leather cover worn smooth by 40 years of use. I turn to the last blank page past the sketches of rusted trusses and the notes on failing rivets, and I find a clean space. I write a single sentence that summarizes every bridge I've ever crossed and every lie I've ever lived through. I am still here. And for the first time, Sarah, the structure is sound. The book closed. The weight lifted. I felt the sharp, metallic snap of the notebook's elastic band, a final punctuation mark on a long, heavy career. My work here is finally done. I stood at the edge of the water, the gray mist of the river cooling my face, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a structure that needed fixing, I just saw the horizon. I looked down at the small clay pot I had brought from the old house on Maple Drive, the only piece of the garden I managed to save. Poking through the dark, frozen soil was a single purple petal, a small flower Sarah had planted years ago. It was blooming against the gray winter backdrop, a sign that while the house was sold and the walls were gone, the life we built is still growing in the cracks. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, the taste of it sharp and clear in my lungs. I reached into my pocket and felt the silver inspector's pin, but I didn't need to wear it anymore. The truth was no longer a burden I had to carry. It was the ground I was standing on. I turned away from the railing and started the walk back to my new home, leaving the notebook on the bench for the river to claim. I didn't look back. There were no more cracks to find, no more lies to measure. Just the steady, heavy purpose of the water and the light of a new year reflecting off the ice. I've spent a lifetime inspecting bridges, but I failed to inspect my own home. I ignored the small cracks, excused the warning signs, and trusted love to hold what discipline should have questioned. If you take anything from my family story, let it be this: don't protect a lie just because it wears a familiar face. Boundaries are not betrayal. They are survival. In many grandpa stories, the old man learns too late. I was almost one of them. I believed sacrifice would be remembered, that silence would preserve peace. It didn't. It only gave room for deception to grow. This family story taught me that respect must be mutual, not inherited. And while I lost much, I kept something greater. My voice, my dignity, and my faith that God sees what people try to bury. So here's my advice. Ask harder questions, read what you sign, and never hand over your name without understanding the cost. Not all grandpa stories end in regret, some end in awakening. Let this family story be one of them. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this journey. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Silas's position, facing a son who erased you to protect his image? Share your perspective below. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more. A gentle note: while inspired by complex family dynamics and financial deception cases, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling.
이게 기본적인 비율이 딸기 절반 설탕이 딱 이만큼. 천맨 이 영상 꼭 못 보게 해라. 천사 오빠 보지마. 여기서 좀 달달한 거 좋아한다 하면은 딸기랑 설탕이 1대1이라 그랬어. 한마디로 설탕을 좀 더 넣겠습니다. 맛있겠다. 한 이 정도만? 당뇨 대기 중. 아니야. 아, 꾸더 오빠? 그니까 무드 꾸더 오빠 보고 싶네 또. 어? 담금주가 빨간 뚜껑이라고? 어? 이거 아닌데? 회장님